I was folding clean laundry in my bedroom when the front door swung open so hard the hinges protested, and the footsteps that followed rolled through the hallway, like a storm bulldozing the calm out of an ordinary Tuesday. My son's voice carried first a hard edge I hadn't heard since he was 17, and swore he'd never forgive me for making him return a stolen watch. I stepped into the hallway and saw him planted in my living room with the stance of an accuser, fists curled, jaw set, those green eyes his father left him blazing, as if I were a stranger who had trespassed in her own home. It wasn't the volume that hurt. It was the certainty, his certainty, that he was entitled not only to my attention, but to my money. He said his wife had called him crying because the card I'd given her had stopped working at the grocery store, and he hurled humiliation at me like a verdict. At 70, dignity is a discipline, not a mood. I told him to lower his voice. I told him the card was mine. I told him we could speak as adults. He told me I was selfish. He told me families didn't put up walls around resources. He paced grooves into my hardwood, then demanded the new password, as if my consent were a minor procedural detail to be supplied on demand. I said no, and I said no without trembling, even as my body did tremble, and I sat in the armchair where I had nursed him 4 decades earlier. He called me a miser. He told me I'd regret the consequences. When he stalked out, the door closed with a sound that made the quiet inside the house turn dense and stale, as if the air had noticed it was no longer respected here. That afternoon, I peeled potatoes to give my hands something useful to do, and let memory do what it always does when I'm frightened: gather me. I remembered what steady had felt like, those 30 years of a life made safe by routine. After my husband Robert died, coffee at 6, the sunlight stepping onto the tiles 1 square at a time, geraniums, begonias, then the bougainvillea climbing the fence in slow, grateful arcs. Robert bought this 2-story house when I was pregnant with our son, and we paid the mortgage the way we did everything together, and exactly on time. After the funeral, I kept order to keep us alive. The meals, the curfews, the insistence on homework, the rules that made a boy into a man. I did not spoil him, and I did not allow him to believe that help was an entitlement. When he graduated, I cried in the elevator when no one could see me. When he found his first job as an accountant, I cooked a whole roast just for us and told him I believed in the life he would build. When he met Chloe, thin, pretty, perfectly turned out with a smile that made you feel evaluated before you felt welcome. I ignored my unease because love is always a risk and suspicion always feels small. She asked after my garden and helped with the dishes. She brought flowers. She looked around as if cataloging. I mistook performance for courtesy and gave them the best wedding my savings could afford. For months after, Sundays were full of steam and laughter, and plates passed across the table. And if Chloe's compliments on my cooking leaned a little theatrical, well, many women of my son's generation speak through a camera even when it isn't turned on. The first request for cash came framed as embarrassment, a tight month, a promise to repay on Friday that bled into next Friday, then amounts that multiplied 200, 305. The new vocabulary arrived next: we for the house, for the life we're building, for opportunities. They used the word investment to describe groceries and shoes. When I tallied 6 months of small rescues and found $5,000 missing from my savings, I tried to speak with them. My son frowned at the ledger and told me families didn't keep score like this. Chloe's smile went soft and self-reproachful and weaponized at once. She offered me her own credit card as collateral, which was a gesture that solved nothing and proved only that she understood how to soothe a conscience without changing a habit. Then came the late-night call about medicine and the request to borrow my card just for a day. The day acquired add-ons, cosmetics here, clothes there, a celebratory dinner framed as a necessity for career advancement. Every emergency turned out to be an impulse. My life had taught me not to embarrass young people in public, so I swallowed spoken shame and took my anger into the privacy of my online banking, where I watched the numbers tick down. The relief I felt when the bank called to flag a $1,200 electronics purchase was not relief at all. It was recognition. I told the bank to block the card and issue a new one. When the phone lit up with Chloe's number a moment later, and she chirped about being stranded at the grocery store with a full cart, I told her the truth with my name in it. It was my card. She said the computer had been for Marcus's work, that she couldn't ask, because I would have said no, and I heard in that sentence the entitlement that had been coiling all year. The next hours were a collage of calls I did not answer, and explanations I did not solicit. When they appeared at my door, they walked in with the key I had given them for emergencies, and sat down as if they were landlords, and I were a tenant late on rent. We argued in the language we share duty sacrifice, the fiction that there was a family card I had never agreed to create. When I spread 24 printed statements across the table, no one looked. When I said I needed time to think, they heard a negotiation. I turned them out of my house to reclaim the silence, but the silence had changed. I did not yet know that we were only at the start of an escalation. The escalation began with the copy. I found it in the lockbox where I keep my passport, and the deed a photocopy of my credit card front and back, with the 3 numbers at the end plain, as if the paper were a confession. In the corner, Chloe had written for emergencies and an initial. If I were a different woman, I might have fallen into the softness they were trying to lay beneath me, a cushion of flattery and implication, and the suggestion that what's yours is not yours if your love is big enough. But I am the woman my life made me, which is to say, I am disciplined in my care, which is to say, I am careful with the things that keep a life standing. The bank mailed me a full certified report. I printed it, and the printer kept breathing paper like a train. I laid the pages out in the bright, honest light of my dining room and looked at my money as if it were a body with new bruises. There were ATM withdrawals at 3 a.m, and purchases made simultaneously across town from one another, and charges in cities I had never driven to. My hand shook only when I dialed my son. He said emergencies couldn't be scheduled and asked if I wanted him to submit daily logs like a child. I said I wanted to understand. He said they would come over. I said I did not want another confrontation. The line went dead. In 20 minutes, Chloe rang the bell alone, this time her face studied into concern, her voice smoothing each sentence as if it were a wrinkle she intended to press flat. She set my card on the table and did not push it across. She suggested that women my age become cautious, that paranoia is a shape reasonable minds take as they age. She said we, as if we were planning a vacation instead of untangling a theft. When she finally slid the card across the table, it felt less like a concession than a dare. I took it. I put it in my blouse pocket as if returning an organ to where it belonged. She kissed the air in my direction when she left and did not close the door softly. The week without calls felt like healing at first, and then like punishment. On day 5, I put on the pearl necklace my husband gave me after a year so brutal it almost ended us. He had pressed the clasp like a prayer behind my neck and told me he wanted me always to remember my worth. Worth is a measurable word when it's money. It's a fog when it's a person. At the market, Mr. Garcia said families always become complicated around money and told me to trust my instincts. A mother's instincts may go quiet when she is shamed, but if you tend to them, they will return louder than the shaming. When my son called to propose a fixed monthly support, he used the word allowance as if their lives were my project budget. I heard the new tactic, which was to turn theft into a stipend and gratitude into unexamined obligation. I said I needed time. He said he was done begging. I asked what he meant by other options. He hung up. On Monday, a young man in a suit introduced himself as an associate from a law firm and explained guardianship to me while standing on my doormat. My son had retained their services to review my mental and financial capacity. The blood left my body in a rush, then returned electric. The man told me to document everything, get exams, hire counsel. For a moment, I felt small. Then I felt my age the way a tree feels its rings, and the fear fell through me like a stone finding earth. I called my neighbor Alma. She came, listened, and named what I had been too tender to say: manipulation. She knew a lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse, a man named Vincent Harris. When I walked into his quiet office with Alma the next morning, Vincent's eyes were kind the way some men's eyes are kind when they have looked at suffering long enough to refuse to confuse pity with help. He asked for every document I owned and for a chronological account that did not spare me. He defined my story in language that restored my spine. He said what had been done to me was criminal, that he would protect me from any attempt to pry the pen from my hand, that he would treat my dignity as if it were a client too. When I signed his retainer, my hand did not tremble. He and his team were as methodical as grief. They pulled camera footage from stores where my card had been used and matched dates, times, and places to the columns in my statements. They requested IP logs for online orders. They tracked packages and discovered 3 additional cards I had not known to look for, all opened in my name and routed to my son's address. He called it identity theft without flinching. He guided me through placing fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus and helped file a criminal complaint. He told me to expect calls, protests, bargains, slander. He told me to document every sound near my door. The calls started the same evening. My son's voice swung between pleading and indignation. He promised restitution. He promised that Chloe's medical needs explained everything. He pointed to medicine while the paper in my hands listed jewelry, perfume, electronics restaurants with haughty names. When Vincent told me to say nothing more and hang up, I followed instruction like it was a rope thrown from a boat. The next day, the other campaign began. Strangers loitered on my sidewalk, pretending to chat while saying older people, and paranoid, and how embarrassing just loud enough. Someone keyed my car with 2 words, crazy miser, and I took pictures with a steadiness I did not know I still owned. Alma moved into my living room on a blanket of stubbornness and love. When Chloe called at 3 a.m. to suggest my dead husband had made dirty money, I let the insult pass through me the way you let smoke blow past your face if someone else's house is burning. The court date arrived like an alarm. I dressed in my quiet best and walked into the courtroom with Alma at my side and Vincent a step ahead. On the other bench, my son watched the floor. Chloe looked at me as if I had betrayed her by resisting her. Vincent's presentation was calm, and devastating documents laid in order recordings that contradicted the narrative of adult consent, a physician's affidavit attesting to my mental clarity, timestamps that located me on my landline, while my card was being swiped across town, IP addresses from their apartment, and the summary ledger, $25,000 subtracted from my savings in 2 years, by hands not mine, plus $15,000 on fraudulent accounts I never opened. The judge's face did not soften for anyone. My son's lawyer tried to widen the room with words, family custom, verbal permission, cultural expectations, but every time he tried to float, Vincent pulled him back down with a receipt. When it was my turn to speak, I did not weaponize my pain. I described it. I said what it is like to sell a small, steady life for the hope that the child you made will keep loving you once he thinks he is bigger than you. I said I never approved the opening of any account and that I had learned my legal vocabulary on the fly out of survival. The judge ruled in my favor cleanly. He tossed the guardianship attempt out as the intimidation tactic it was ordered, the immediate cancellation of the fraudulent accounts, and the correction of my credit file, mandated repayment with interest and legal fees, and entered a restraining order. No direct contact for a year, all communication through counsel. When we walked out into the sunlight, Alma squeezed my hand and whispered, "You held the line." I did not feel triumphant. I felt right-sized again, not small. not giant, but proper. The months that followed were practical, which is its own kind of relief. Money began to return in monthly court-ordered drips, and I drew a new architecture around my days. Vincent called often under the pretense of updates. He had a way of talking about legal filings as if they were gardening tips, and of talking about gardening as if it were a strategy for living. We sat on my patio with our coffees cooling beside us, and compared notes on pruning and plaintiffs. He asked how I'd trained the bougainvillea to climb so generously, and listened like the question mattered. The first time our hands touched it was accidental, and the second time it wasn't. He had lost his wife 5 years earlier, and kept his grief where a practical man keeps what he values close enough to be useful, protected enough to be private. What began as a discipline of defense altered into a discipline of gentleness. The study where Robert kept his ledgers became a library we shared. The house softened again. When Vincent decided to take on more pro bono cases for older adults who had been stripped quietly by the people they loved, I watched him rediscover a purpose that wasn't just the law, it was dignity. Every time we restore what someone took, he said we teach a heart that it wasn't wrong to expect respect. I believed him. But the peace did not mean that memory had been erased, and habit is an animal that walks the same path even after you build a fence. I found myself glancing toward the door at dusk, waiting for a son who could knock gently and mean it. I cooked too much, as if muscle memory were a guest I didn't know how to turn away. I learned to hold grief in my mouth like a hard candy present sweet sometimes never dissolved. I did not call my son. Twice my phone flashed his name, and I let it pass into the voicemail net I no longer checked. Vincent never told me what to do with the softest parts of my longing. He gave them room. When the 1-year restraining order ran out, letters arrived, apologies swaddled in requests, confessions wrapped in rationalizations. I stayed with my discipline. There are animals that approach with lowered heads when they want to pass beneath a fence. I recognize the posture because I used to be the one who lowered my head, mistaking surrender for kindness. It was Alma who saw the shift in me before I did. She told me I had begun to laugh with my whole face again. She said my shoulders had moved out of my ears and back to where they belonged. She brought over cuttings for my garden and taught me the stubbornness of rosemary, the way it insists on itself, in poor soil and good. We started walking together a slow, regular circuit around the neighborhood that returned us to my porch with the feeling that our feet knew something. Our heads hadn't yet articulated the world continues. The court-appointed payments kept landing, and I started a small habit of saving receipts from the kind things I did for myself: a new pair of walking shoes, a stack of used books, the good olive oil. Alma called them my counterledgers. She said I was documenting proof that care given inward can be honest too. The call came 6 months after Vincent and I stood in a small municipal room and promised each other we would be each other's future. We had married quietly, as if our vows were a conversation and not a performance. I wore a blue dress the color of twilight and carried a single white flower I'd cut from my yard. Alma signed as my witness. Vincent's brother brought a bottle of something dry and hopeful. The home we returned to after our ceremony was the same house I'd defended, but it felt as if it were now held by 4 hands instead of 2. In our evenings, he worked on briefs and I cooked, and then we surrendered our work to the soft tyranny of shared television. We argued good-naturedly about sauces. We read adjacent books and traded paragraphs we loved. Some nights we sat in the dark and listened to the cicadas play their insistence. It is not hard to fall in love at 70. It is hard to believe you're allowed to. Vincent never even suggested that I had to choose between my history and my hope. He treated both as the rails that made my train possible. So when my son called one afternoon in that empty hour before dinner, when the light coming through the blinds tasted like old photographs, I answered. He said his marriage had ended. He said Chloe had left him for a different future, and taken what hadn't been taken already. He said he was sorry. He said the word sorry as if pronunciation were penitence. I let him speak until the apology ran out of breath. I told him I had forgiven him already, which was true. Forgiveness is a selfish act if you do it right. It unhooks your insides from a hook someone else put there. But forgiving is not returning. I told him we could try for a version of a future where politeness grows, and then trust plants itself inside politeness, and then one day we might discover the leaf of something better. I told him that version depended on him learning the difference between help and access need, and entitlement, regret, and repair. He did not promise a transformation. He said he would try. It felt like a human sentence, which is to say, I believed it only as far as I could see. Trust is slow, and boundaries are a kind of love when you hold them with the right grip. I learned to love from a distance without making distance a weapon. I learned the quiet art of not rescuing in case survival might teach what comfort never could. Vincent never kept tally of my progress, and neither did I. Days stacked. The garden obeyed and misbehaved according to its own calendar, which made me feel that nature is the best therapist. It insists that cycles are not failures, but forms. The neighborhood women moved me to the front row of their bench gossip, and I remembered how friendship can sound like laughter and not like strategy. Once at the market, Mr. Garcia squeezed my hand and told me I had my old step back. "You weren't wrong to love," he said, as if overhearing my most complicated thought. "You were wrong to let love replace wisdom." He charged me less for cucumbers that day and refused to admit it. The paperwork on my case ended, but the court record stayed. Vincent took 3 more cases that spring resembling mine in the worst ways, and every victory felt like pulling a nail from wood. Sometimes he came home furious at what had been done to women whose only mistake was confusing access with intimacy. Sometimes he came home quiet, and I learned to sit with that quiet without filing it with words. We started traveling in small circles of intention. A day trip to the lake, a weekend to a town with a bookstore that specialized in out-of-print cookbooks, a slow drive through a neighboring county to watch the fields turn color. Age does not diminish hunger if you feed it with real food. We cooked dishes I had always wanted to make and never had time for, and we invited Alma, and we invited Mr. Garcia, and we invited people who loved their families without needing to own them. It felt like building a table with extra leaves and resisting the temptation to fill every chair. The first holiday season after the trial arrived, and with it, the familiar old ache of empty chairs. My son did not call. We ate in the dining room anyway, at the same table where I had once spread my statements, where I had once watched a man I loved turn into a version of himself I could not recognize. Vincent proposed a toast to earned peace. I realized I had not once that week looked toward the door expecting a key in the lock. We watched a movie where everyone got what they deserved, which is how movies save us from the truths we carry. I went to bed early, and when I woke in the dark to drink water and stood at the window, my garden in the moonlight looked like a testimony I'd forgotten I was writing evidence of care, proof of patient disciplined joy, maintained even after a season that had tried to strip it bare. When my son finally wrote me a letter that did not contain requests or justifications, only the recognition of harm and the plan for repair, I read it twice, and then a third time, and then folded it into a drawer I did not open often. He had found counseling a phrase men of his generation still sometimes say like a challenge to a dare. He had repaid the last of the court-ordered money and sent attached a list of actions he was taking that did not involve me. It was the first time he wrote me a sentence built out of his own verbs. He didn't ask to visit. He said he would understand if I needed more time. I carried the letter around for a week inside the pocket of my cardigan, like a temperature I wasn't ready to admit I could feel. I didn't respond immediately. There are kinds of hope you water slowly because you have learned not to drown delicate things with your eagerness. When I wrote back, I thanked him for the evidence of change and asked for nothing more. Type, continue to receive the next part. The year bent toward its own soft ending, and with it, I learned how to be the age I am, not an apology and not a fight. I had been building a new life without daring at first to call it new. The elements were familiar. The house, the garden, the quiet hobbies, the simple meals. But the structure was different. What held everything together was the explicit promise I had made to myself in a courtroom and a kitchen and a sleepless night. I would not trade my respect for belonging ever again. Respect in practice looks like dull, almost invisible daily choices. I watched my accounts every Monday morning. I changed passwords quarterly, wrote them down on paper, and put that paper in the bank box. I tightened the circle of who had keys to my house. I made a new will with a lawyer who made eye contact kindly and preferred plain language to sentimental fog. There was some satisfaction in these measures, but there was more than that. There was the sensation of leaning on a railing I had installed myself. I moved through my days without the low, raw hum of vulnerability. Vincent and I developed a shared language for past and future that did not erase either. Sometimes I would tell him about the early years with Robert and our son, and the way grief had surprised me by arriving not only heavy, but also bright, like a picture I could suddenly see in high resolution. Sometimes he would tell me about the tenderness and exhaustion of caring for a partner with an illness that refused to listen to love. We did not compare our losses like scores. We placed them side by side and let them teach each other manners. He liked to say that the sweetest second chances are the ones we build instead of the ones we're handed. I like to say that survival is the most underrated love story. I saw my son twice that spring in safe public places, where conversations have natural edges, a cafe with loud milk steamers, a park where strollers required us to pause every other sentence. He arrived smaller in his arrogance and larger in his listening. He did not touch my hand until I reached for his. He did not mention money, not even once, not even to brag about the absence of the request. He asked about my garden in a way that sounded like curiosity rather than surveillance. He said he had learned words he had once mocked: boundaries, accountability, repair, and was learning how to live them quietly. He spoke about Chloe without bitterness, which is one of the hardest tests of remorse. He didn't ask to come home because he now understood the house was not his to enter. I left both meetings with the sensation that gratitude and grief can stand shoulder to shoulder without trying to push the other off the path. When the story of our courtroom war made its way through the slow channels that carry neighborhood news, some people stopped speaking to me, as if silence were a loyalty badge they needed to flash at the door of their own living rooms. Others approached me with the careful kindness of women who recognize themselves in the outline of your story. One woman asked how I knew when to act. I told her what Mr. Garcia had told me in front of the oranges: a mother's instincts are not a superstition. They are a wisdom organ, and you have to keep it fed with truth. Another woman asked me how to endure the loneliness that arrives when you stop making yourself useful to people who have confused your love with their lack. I told her the loneliness is real but temporary. It is the sound of your life recalibrating itself to a steadier frequency. The case files Vincent kept stacked in his study began to include thank you notes from clients whose daughters or nephews or church acquaintances had taught them the hard lesson I learned. Generosity without borders grows predators. We started hosting a monthly afternoon at the community center to talk about financial safety in ways that don't feel like punishment. We served tea and good cookies and told stories that didn't humiliate. Vincent explained how to freeze credit reports and why to keep photocopies away from anyone who is not a spouse or a literal emergency. I explained how to say no so that it closes a door without slamming it, and how to say yes in shapes that will not bankrupt you. Alma sat at the sign-in table and made people laugh on purpose to break the spell of shame. Sometimes my son would send me an article he found about elder abuse, and I would send back a simple thank you. That was the best language for our stage of repair, specific and modest. And we did not turn my story into a brand, but we did allow it to be useful. There were days when usefulness felt like purpose, and days when it felt like reopening a wound. On those days, Vincent and I would leave the center and drive without a destination. No music, the windows open. The silence companionable because it had nothing to prove. In the evenings, I learned new recipes on purpose because life requires newness the way the garden requires pruning. We celebrated our anniversary by replastering a crack in the kitchen wall we had ignored for years, then painting the room a bright, generous white that made the morning coffee taste like something you earned. The letter my son sent midsummer was careful. He asked if he could visit the garden on a Sunday afternoon while Vincent was home, just to see the geraniums and sit on the porch where he had learned his first multiplication table. I said yes because my boundaries were not designed to punish. They were designed to orient. We ate lemon cookies. He told us about a job he had taken that was not glamorous and that he liked precisely because it did not require anyone else to lose. He apologized to Vincent for the legal hoops and to Alma for sleeping in our living room because she refused to leave me alone. We walked the yard. He admired the way the bougainvillea had stubbornly refused to do anything but thrive. When he left, he hugged me the way you hug a person you haven't yet forgiven yourself for hurting. The next day, I found he had left an envelope on the porch. Inside, a receipt for a donation to the community center's elder safety program and a note that said only, "Thank you for saving yourself." Grief never entirely leaves. It changes job descriptions. Mine had gone from jailer to archivist. It kept the file of the years when I mistook permission for love, and it kept the file of the day I said no, as if my life depended on it, and discovered that it did. Some mornings I still woke with the old instinct to prove my generosity. I would stand at the kitchen counter with my coffee and remind myself of a simple equation. Generosity is only generous if you choose it freely. Sacrifice without consent is how resentment gets born. Vincent and I held that equation between us like an heirloom we meant to pass on, not to a child, but to the people who visited our table, hungry for a different set of rules. When I think about the day the door slammed and the room lost its air, I no longer see a single scene. I see a system I once believed was unbreakable, and now know is delicate respect, consent, accountability, love. The story I have told you is not about a password or even about a card. It is about the cost of allowing yourself to be devoured by people who claim that devouring is the same thing as belonging. It took me a lifetime to learn that boundaries are the choreography of love, and that the first person you owe that dance to is yourself. I could end here with the safety secured, and the happy remarriage, and the slow, hopeful efforts of a son who finally is learning to carry his own weight. But endings don't erase beginnings. They explain them. What I understand now is how easy it is to confuse history with destiny. I loved my son. I still do. I mistook the boy I raised for the man he became, and thought my loyalty to one required my submission to the other. The gift of age is that you begin to see how the patterns repeat and where you can interrupt them without breaking your own heart in half. The interruption looks simple from the outside: a phone call to a bank, a meeting with a lawyer, a stack of papers. Inside, it was a revolution. It required me to accept that love without respect is counterfeit, that help without limits is harm, that the people who call you miser when you pull your resources back are telling you exactly what you need to know about your future with them. My son and Chloe weaponized different stories to get what they wanted, cultural scripts about loyal mothers and generous elders, modern myths about support looking like a luxury lifestyle. The oldest trick of all, which is to make a woman doubt her mind, so she will lean her weight on anyone who offers a steady shoulder. When the law named what had been done to me, fraud, theft, abuse, I felt less alone, not because I wanted vengeance, but because I wanted accuracy. The most important part of this story is not the courtroom victory, or the repayment checks, or even the new marriage that surprised me into life. It is the fact that I learned to live with my own no without flinching. The first time you say it, your whole body protests because your body wants harmony the way a plant wants light. But there are times when your no is the light. The simple habits that grew out of that sentence remade the landscape of my days. I did not become a hard woman. I became a woman with a spine. And here is a gentler truth. Some of the tenderness I once spilled outward without measure has flowed back into me and turned into patience for the slowness of repair. I do not expect my son to be a new man. I expect him to be a practicing one. Practice is what grows new hearts. And if the practice slips as practice always does, I now know how to protect what I've rebuilt. You might be listening in a city where the streets you know best are the ones between your home and your children's houses. Or you might be alone in a room that you pay for yourself and stunned that safety can feel lonely. You might be a daughter, afraid to watch her mother age into a woman who is easy to steal from. Or a son who doesn't know how to ask for help without pretending help is owed. Wherever you sit inside this story, I hope you feel the truth humming in it. Love that requires you to vanish is not love. Respect that is contingent on access is not respect. Generosity that leaves you empty is not generosity. It is an extraction dressed in gratitude's clothing. If you are waiting for permission to hold your own line, let me give you mine. If you are waiting for a sign that you can begin again, late in life without apology, let this be it. On certain evenings, when the kitchen smells like garlic and rosemary, and Vincent is humming a song his children used to dance to, I step into the garden just to make sure the bougainvillea is still doing the only thing it knows, reaching. The trunk isn't pretty. It is a practical braid of old decisions. The blossoms are reckless, as if beauty were a dare. I touch the wood in thanks. I look up at the exact piece of sky the plant has chosen for itself. I think about a boy I nursed in a chair, and the man he had to slow down to become. I wish him a life earned in smaller wants. I wish him the humility to understand that power without tenderness is just a loud room you eventually have to leave. Then I go back inside and say the simple words that keep my life pointed in the right direction. We are enough like this. If you have a story like mine, I hope the lesson I learned can spare you the worst of what I endured. You are allowed to keep what you earned. You are allowed to be generous by choice. You are allowed to love people who do not love you well without letting them decide what you deserve. Dignity is not a luxury. It is the ground. When you stand on it, everything else mercy repair, even joy can finally learn where to land. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you for your time and your open heart. If this story moved you or gave you a fragment of courage you needed, please like this video so it reaches someone else who might be struggling in silence. Share it with a friend who needs the reminder that no can be holy. Subscribe for more true life stories about resilience and reclaiming dignity, and leave a comment telling me what moment resonated most with you. Your words help build a community where wisdom and kindness win.